I now look to Deborah Jones to continue the case for the proposition.
Thank you, Mr. President, distinguished guests and visitors. Thank you very much for this opportunity. Seriously, can anyone deny that the seeds of democracy so spectacularly strewn about during the old so-called Arab Spring fell on barren ground? 7 years on, a recent NGO report on political pluralism in the region describes a landscape deeply hostile to democracy, characterized above all by violence, social tension, renewed authoritarianism, and humanitarian crisis, and concludes that the best we can attempt to do is to eke out more space for civil engagement, but concedes there's little context for political plurality. Western liberal democracy, or as de Tocqueville coined it, the sovereignty of the people, is designed to restrain governments through the separation of powers, open competition between political parties, adherence to rule of law, equal protection of human rights, civil liberties, and political freedoms, and the personal ownership of property, all grounded in a constitution that serves as social contract. Democracy, we say, is the passage from physical to verbal violence, structured argumentation that ideally distills the will of the majority while protecting individual rights and society's weakest members. I would submit this is inherently at odds with the cultural and historical norms of the Middle East. Indeed, were a time traveler to visit from so-called medieval era in Europe, prior to the great Protestant rejection of divinely ordered hierarchy and the social revolution that accompanied the expansion of capitalist mercantile society, he or she, albeit agog at the technology and the technological advances, would feel rather at home in the culture. To wit, a sacral society focused on spiritual salvation in the afterlife with primacy of family and communal identity, the importance of status and hierarchy, and allegiance to individuals imbued with hereditary authority whose control is manifest through the procurement of sophisticated weaponry and close alignment with their militaries. And where there's political competition, it's not over the question of democratic models, rather the mode of authoritarianism, i.e. whether it's preferable to have an autocratically ruled, ostensibly secular Westphalian nation-state having an Islamic caste by virtue of its population, or a progressively Islamist state that employs the mechanics of elections and political discourse to move toward greater compliance with Sharia under an increasingly authoritarian and directive regime. Whatever the case, the model is neither Des Moines, Iowa, nor Westminster. It is 9th century Umayyad Caliphate of Cordoba, a cosmopolitan center of intellectual ferment and commercial endeavor where living standards were high for productive minorities who were tolerated as long as they avoided politics and accepted their second-class status. Or it was 16th century Constantinople, following the 1453 conquest by Mehmet Fatih. Forget about universal suffrage. This is about the benign stewardship of subordinates in accordance with an understanding of the inexorable submission by all to inherently superior Islamic principles of governance, because the Quran, after all, is the seal of the book. And Muhammad, peace be upon him, is the last of God's prophets. And within the implicit hierarchies of a superior faith, there is an acceptance of destiny, of foreordained human stations in life, as well as the notion of obedience to a righteous leader. A well-known Jordanian political analyst succinctly assessed the root causes of the so-called Arab Spring of 2011 as being centered around questions of humiliation and legitimacy, as opposed to democratic participation, where humiliation, the inability to find dignified work and thus to start a family, and erosion in middle-class income, widespread corruption, and a decline in quality of life, coexisted with regimes whose longevity was premised solely on repression, absent any hereditary entitlement, and thank you later, namely the Arab republics of Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, Syria, and Yemen. Violence ensued and regimes were toppled. Conversely, where people accepted the legitimacy of the rulers, regimes prevailed, and it's perhaps no coincidence that these durable regimes all happen to be monarchies, no matter how affluent or not, or successful at job creation. In other words, democracy was not the fundamental issue. The Thobes prevailed and the blue jeans lost, and what do I mean by that? I would suggest that the political psyche of a nation is revealed in its national dress. The most democratic of all costumes, apart from the birthday suit, are blue jeans or Levi jeans, generically after their inventor. They conceal personal status, and they symbolize a desire to fit in, and are the choice of informal dress throughout Western society. These days, in fact, the more expensive the jeans, the shabbier they look. Close behind is the ubiquitous business suit, that most practical of uniforms worn by presidents, prime ministers, and sales clerks alike, which permits a degree of respectful formality while allowing one to roll up his sleeves and get to work. This democratic dress is in stark contrast to the so-called sumptuary laws that characterize medieval Europe, with their sartorial delineations of social hierarchy. Perhaps the closest thing to modern-day sumptuary laws is found in the Gulf Arab states, whose decidedly elite national dress is prohibited to expatriates. Their guest worker status made clear by their business suits, jeans, or workers' coveralls, depending on their caste. The national dress, the thobe, the dishdash, the bis, the kaftan, reflects a natural hierarchy. They are designed for positions of mandate, not servitude nor labor. One does not change one's tie or lift boxes of books from one room to the next. A spare dishdash, in fact, is carried in the car in the event of an inopportune pen leak or food spill. It is the pristine dress of devolved autocratic authority in a world where people know their place, where a majority opt to believe that their station in life is a function of birth and not the result of personal fortitude. I would suggest that where it's considered beneath oneself to lift the bonnet of one's car, or wash one's car, or sully one's hands working in the garden, we shall never encounter Western democracy per se. Piloting one's own helicopter does not fall into the same category. And in fairness to the relatively small, affluent, culturally cohesive, and intimate Gulf Arab societies, one must ask whether they would in fact see any benefit in adopting the fractious, divisive, and increasingly impotent models of Western democracy on current display. No doubt the democratic coin has been tarnished by current practice, but meanwhile countries like China offer a model perhaps more compatible culturally where society takes precedence over self. And none other than Thomas Jefferson is said to have been fascinated by the consensus-driven governance models of America's indigenous tribes, declaring that the optimum form of democracy insofar as the chieftain shares the challenges and tribulations of his people. In any event, oil economies have enabled the rise of so-called nanny states, whose citizens benefit from perhaps the most generous outpouring of social welfare in history, as well as a reliable, relatively inexpensive supply of international labor, skilled and otherwise. But their preference for benign authoritarian social engineering over the messy and inefficient business of civic engagement and negotiated change is quite understandable. This facile externality, absent persistent need that motivates invention and change, may ensure that they remain consumers rather than political activists. And as for the regional blue jeans, the citizens of Egypt, Turkey, and Iraq, countries whose geography, history, more complex economies, and developed administrative states have produced educated middle classes, intellectual elites, and a pool of diverse, integrated ethnicities, they've experienced periodic democratic spasms in their quest for genuine civic engagement, but sadly, a pervasive authoritarian impulse harkening back to imperial glory, whether pharaonic, Ottoman, or Abbasid, repeatedly stifles any democratic inklings in a tragic bait and switch. Iraq's recent election of a coalition led by Muqtada Sadr, a religious political actor operating both in the interests of his nation and from a faith-based worldview, is but one example of the sort of hybrid political formulas that may emerge from the region and prove to be effective governance models. Their success will depend on the extent which they are able to interact institutionally with the West, given the scale and interdependence of global economy and security interests. I do not suggest that individuals from the Middle East are ill-suited to Western-style democracy. Many have made the choice to vote with their feet, as it were, and engage in the rough and tumble of Western civic life. But for the region as a whole, those seeking to superimpose Western democracy on ancient cultures would do well to heed the words of one of history's most famous teachers, who warned his disciples against putting new wine into old bottles, else the bottles break and the wine runneth out, just as Iraq shattered. Thank you.